Good afternoon, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Today, we're joined by Enid Gort, John Caher, and Tom Ruller for our program, A Bridge to Justice, The Life of Franklin H. Williams. Enid Gort is an anthropologist and Africanist. Her articles have appeared in numerous academic journals, including the Journal of African Studies and Social Science and Medicine. She wrote a chapter entitled Swazi Traditional Healers, Role Transformation and Gender in African Feminism, the Politics of Survival in Sub-Saharan Africa, edited by Dr. Gwendolyn Michael. A consultant on an award-winning PBS documentary on Ambassador Williams, she holds a degree in education from Keene College and master's and doctoral degrees from Columbia University. John Caher is the author or co-author of 8 books and the principal writer of a PBS documentary on Franklin H. Williams, A Bridge to Justice. Caher has degrees from Syracuse University and Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. He is a former reporter and editor for the Albany Times-Union and bureau chief for the New York Law Journal. Caher's reporting has garnered more than 20 awards, including prestigious honors from the American Bar Association, the New York State Bar Association, and the Erie County Bar Association. Thomas J. Ruller has held the position of New York State Archivist since 2015. He has been an active professional and is the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. He has been a consultant for several state governments and other organizations focusing on electronic records management and preservation. For those of you who have joined us today, there will be a question and answer session at the end of this presentation, so you can feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And now I am pleased to introduce Enid Gort, John Caher, and Tom Ruller.
Josie, thank you very much. And John, Enid, I've been really looking forward to this program. I think because it feeds a perspective that I have about the role of archives and history that often doesn't get expanded on enough. In the state archives, we preserve 33 miles of the state's historical records from the Dutch period to the modern era. Those are records of institutions, and they're the records that about people, and they tell the stories of individual people, but the institutions themselves are operated by people, and they're created by people, and they're led by people. Today's program is going to talk about a really important person and sort of get inside, not the institution, but the person that Franklin H. Williams was. And I'm really excited about that because it tells us the backstory. And I think there are no two people who can do this story better than the two of you. And so I'm going to take a back seat, watch and enjoy, and let the two of you illuminate Franklin H. Williams' life for all of us. So thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Josie. And thank you to the New York Archives Trust, not only for hosting this program and others in the online series, but for all you do to make history and knowledge accessible. In the history of the civil rights struggle, legendary figures like Martin Luther King and Thurgood Marshall live on prominently in the history books and in popular culture. But others are hidden figures who live only in the footnotes, the archives. And that includes a group of exceptionally intelligent Black men and women known as the bridge figures. Now, these pioneers moved easily in Black and white society because of their intellect, style, and grace. They built bridges through reason and persuasion and example, and they were conciliatory without being appeasers or enablers. This group includes people that you may be vaguely familiar with or maybe not. People like James Farmer, Lauren Miller, Constance Baker Motley, Dorothy Height, Whitney Young, Vernon Jordan, and a man we want to introduce you to today, Franklin Williams. Franklin Williams was a top lieutenant of Thurgood Marshall, a pioneer in the line of cases that ultimately led the Supreme Court to clamp down on the racial stacking of juries. He built the NAACP in the western third of the country. He worked in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations as an organizer of the Peace Corps, a United Nations representative, ambassador to Ghana. He ran the Phelps-Stokes Fund and served as chairman of what is now the Franklin H. Williams Judicial Commission, the first court-based entity in the nation committed to racial and ethnic fairness in the courts. The commission was established more than 30 years ago by a visionary and very courageous chief judge named Sal Locklear, and it is a vibrant and permanent part of the New York court system. And I think it is fair to say the commission has never been more active, more vibrant, or more necessary. So this afternoon, Dr. Gort, Enid, and I will dig into the footnotes as well as the archives and tell a story that needs to be told, which of course is why archives exist. I never met Franklin Williams, and I knew him only from the archives and from the memories of those who did know him. Enid, on the other hand, knew him well and benefited from dozens of interviews with him in the last year of his life. And so she's the real expert here. I'm going to let Enid do most of the talking while I revert to a role of talk show host. So Enid, can you share the story of how you first met Franklin Williams? A great story about how you encountered a man you never heard of before until he woke you up very early one morning.
Well, it was a very strange story, but it had a happy ending. I had just returned from Swaziland, where I had done 3 years of anthropological research. And I was sleeping one morning and I was awakened by the ring of a telephone, and I picked up the receiver, and at the end of it was a man with a gruff voice who said, "Good morning, my name is Ambassador Franklin Hall Donald Lowry Williams, and I'd like you to come over to my office this morning and have breakfast with me. And it should only take you about 15 minutes because I'm right around the corner." And, you know, being awakened from a deep sleep, I felt this was a prank call and I was ready to hang up. But there was something about the voice and something about the man and something about what he said that led me to comply. And I found myself at the Phelps-Stokes Fund ringing the doorbell, and the door opened and a very distinguished looking, very elegant man put out his hand and said, "I am Ambassador Williams, won't you come in?" And he took me to his office. It was in a small brownstone, so the offices were small and intimate. And he said, after we exchanged some pleasantries and I spoke a little bit about Swaziland, he said, "I spoke with Gil Jonas this morning and he recommended that I speak to you." I had met Gil Jonas at a party a few nights earlier. Gil had worked in the Foreign Service and I found him an interesting man. And we had talked a great deal, but that it was just all in passing. And so now he's telling me that he had already spoken to Gil Jonas early in the morning. He said, "I'd like to offer you a job." And I was flabbergasted and I didn't know what to make of it. But I said, I'm really appreciative and I'm complimented that you would do that. I said, "But I don't know if you know that I am going to be writing my doctoral dissertation, and I assume that will take quite a while. So I'm really in no position to consider a job." And he said, "Well, I'll tell you what," he said, "we can talk about salary and other things like that later, but why don't you go home and think about my offer?" So I went home and my husband was still getting dressed. He had yet to go to work. And he said, "Well, what happened?" And I told him, and I said, "The man offered me a job, but I can't take it." And so my husband said, "I would rethink that. You know, this organization sounds like it would be a place that you would really like to work at. It has all your interests. And you might want to contact him and go back and talk it out with him." So I did that. And I said, "You know, the problem for me is time. I can't be writing a dissertation at Columbia and doing a good job for the Phelps-Stokes Fund." He said, "Well, I thought about a solution to the problem." He said, "I'm going to give you a key. You can come and go as you like. You can go work at Columbia when you feel like it. You can come here when you feel like it. And we'll work it out, and we'll work it out, and we'll work it out together." So I accepted the job, and that's how I met Franklin Williams.
So this guy you never knew calls you at 7:30 in the morning, offers you a job you had not sought, with a salary to be determined later and duties to be determined later. You can come and go as you like.
That's about the size of it. Yeah.
So that's kind of a good deal. So you get over there, and what's this guy like? I mean, what is he like? Not as a public persona. How is he to work for? Is he a yeller and a screamer? Does he show up? What kind of a person is he when he's not in the limelight, when he's on the job with other people?
Franklin's door was always open. And when he didn't have a reason to close it because he had a guest, anybody, any staff member, regardless of what their job was, could walk in, sit down, and talk to Franklin. I mean, he was that accommodating for his staff. I found something unusual about Franklin, and it's something that taught me more about him. He would always say, even when he talked publicly to people, I like to have people working for me who make me look good. And I thought, what a disingenuous statement to make. He's the smartest man in the room. Everybody knows that. So why would he say that publicly? But I realized that by saying that, he was demonstrating that he was really self-confident. I mean, really self-confident, and that he had no fear of putting other people in the limelight. He shared the limelight always with his staff members, and also that he was not afraid to let people know that he was complimenting them and making them feel proud of the work they did. And I realized that he had an ulterior motive in doing this, because most employers don't speak that way about their staff. And so by doing so to an audience, it made him look good. It made him look special. It made him look like an even better leader than he was. And I realized then that Franklin never did anything without knowing exactly what he was doing. And therefore, it gave me confidence as somebody who worked for him that he was trustworthy, and he was sure of himself, and he was knowledgeable. And I think he imparted those characteristics to his staff.
It sounds like he was sure enough of himself that he wasn't threatened or challenged by surrounding himself with smart people and people who may know more about certain things than him. Is that correct?
Right, but even if we didn't know more than he did, and I doubt that anyone on the staff did, he wanted us to feel confident. He wanted us to feel sure. And on the other hand, he wanted to project to his audiences that he was confident enough to say things like that. It was a double-barreled kind of way of praising other people and making himself appear as self-confident as he really was.
Mm-hmm. Now, as a lawyer, I mentioned he was a civil rights attorney. And in a legal sense, I think maybe his greatest contributions are, as I alluded to earlier, contributing to the line of cases which culminated in Batson v. Kentucky in 1986, where the Supreme Court said you cannot use peremptory challenges to racially stacked juries. And another Supreme Court case he had upheld the what's known as the exclusionary rule, which is that illegally obtained evidence cannot be used. And this was a case where a very, very guilty murderer and rapist had confessed, but the confession was the product of a coercion. So legally, I think that might be his most significant contributions. But the cases that I look at that are most dramatic, most exciting, probably most impactful to him in a lot of ways are basically two of them. One of them, the Isaac Woodard matter, and the other, Groveland. Isaac Woodard was a decorated Army veteran who had just been released from the Army. And he's on his way home to reunite with his wife, taking a Greyhound bus, and he makes the mistake of talking back to a white bus driver, which is something you don't do in the Deep South in 1945. The bus driver calls the police. The police punished Sergeant Woodard with a nightstick so viciously that he ruptured both his eyeballs with a billy club and blinded him for life. Franklin represented him in a civil case. There was never a criminal case, suing the officers and the municipality. And the verdict was, it was self-defense. And one of the things at trial, part of the testimony at trial, there was some allegation that Woodard had been drunk and obnoxious, although that was disputed and there was no physical evidence of that. The evidence of that was a witness who said, no sober N would dare talk to a white bus driver the way he did, therefore he must have been drunk. Franklin and Woodard became a team and did a lot of fundraising for the NAACP. Groveland is also a famous case. It's a real life To Kill a Mockingbird, only 4 times worse. 4 young black men were falsely accused of raping a white girl in Groveland, Florida. One of the young men was chased into the Florida swamps by a posse and shot 200 times, at which, as in the Woodard case, was deemed to be self-defense. And Franklin defended the others at what was clearly a sham trial. The men were convicted, 2 of them sentenced to the electric chair, but Franklin persuaded the Supreme Court to reverse the convictions and order a retrial. They were convicted anew and sentenced anew, but real long story, real short, they were posthumously exonerated just a couple of years ago. Enid, there was one thing that happened at the end of the trial that I think was especially memorable for Franklin. Can you share that story? What happened at the end of the Groveland trial?
Well, at the end of the trial, and the trial was held in this courtroom in Groveland, Florida, which looked like it could have been a set in a Hollywood movie. It was small and it was filled with crackers, and it was white people who were clearly hostile to Franklin and to the case that was being brought. And when the case was over, Franklin caught the eye of an elderly black man who had been sitting in the black section, and it was clear the message was, get out of here. And so Franklin grabbed Horace Hill, who was the young black law student who he had hired to drive him to and from Orlando, which was 30 miles away, because it was the only place they could stay in the region. And so Franklin hustled out and he went with Horace, and they tried to round up the 2 black reporters that had come from the north, and they had some difficulty doing that. And so finally, with Franklin, the sweat pouring down Franklin's face, they got in the car and they started to drive. And very shortly, they perceived that they were being followed by 2 cars. And Horace just put his foot on the gas, and he began a 30-mile drive at 90 miles an hour. And in the course of that drive, 2 other cars joined the 2 that were following them. So there were 4 cars, and Franklin could see in the rear view mirror that there were 2 to 3 men in each of these cars. But Horace drove through red lights, missing trucks and other vehicles by inches, over railroad tracks as the gates were falling, and finally turned into the black area of Orlando, jettisoned the car. They ran into the well-built hotel, which was the only hotel in that whole region that accommodated blacks, ran in the front door, ran out the back door, and they all dispersed, and Franklin found himself near a movie and went in and mingled with the crowd. And he sat in the movie until he felt it was safe to come out. And he did, and he went back to his hotel, and he vowed that he would never again go south. And that was not something that a promise that he could keep, because he soon found himself having to return to argue the case in front of the Florida Supreme Court, which he did. But for the rest of his life, Franklin never looked forward or never would go south for a vacation in Florida or visit anybody that he knew in the Carolinas. He just never wanted to go south again.
So this was a lynch mob, right?
Yes, it was. I didn't
And
say that. I thought people would realize that that was a lynch mob.
and during trial, one of his clients whispered to him that the sheriff, who was a corrupt brute who had that's another story, had told him, who didn't like the way Franklin was representing them, said, "I'm going to get that end lawyer." And I think there's considerable speculation that the lynch mob was inspired by, or certainly operated under the protection of the sheriff, who certainly did nothing outside the courthouse to prevent people from going after, Franklin and his colleagues, right?
Well, I should tell you that the sheriff was one of the organizers of the Ku Klux Klan in that area. So he was also accused of being the man who killed Henry Moore in Florida. And years later, they found evidence that it was that particular Clavern that was involved in that murder. So yes, they had a history of lynching. Those people had a history of lynching, some successful, more than most successful lynchings in their area.
One of the things that struck me is, to back up, both the film and the book that arose from it are deeply rooted in archives. And to start, the initial report of what became the Franklin Williams Commission and the background materials are all in the New York archives, and they give a thorough, if troubling, look at racial and ethnic bias in the courts as it existed 30 years ago. A updated version of the report by Secretary Jay Johnson makes many of the same conclusions. And also in the archives is, I'm a recovering journalist, and I know how to use the Freedom of Information Act to obtain public records, which was what archives are. And it occurred to us that a black civil rights attorney in 1950, hanging out with someone so obviously subversive and dangerous as Thurgood Marshall, may have attracted the attention of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. So we submitted a Freedom of Information Act request, not knowing what we were going to get. We got back 186 pages that showed that the FBI surely knew who he was, surely knew where he was, but they didn't find a thing negative, and they were looking, which I thought was interesting. Also on the topic of archives, the greatest collection of archives dealing with Franklin Williams are at the Schomburg Center in Harlem, a branch of the New York Public Library. And they have boxes and boxes and boxes of materials on Franklin, most of it archived by Dr. Gort. And that collection is a real treasure trove of materials. And it's about to become even more of a treasure trove. Dr. Gort is donating her dozens of audio tapes with Franklin and other people she interviewed, as well as the transcripts. And that will include insightful observations of famous figures who knew Franklin, people like Sergeant Shriver, President Kennedy's brother-in-law, who was the organizer of the Peace Corps, and several others. But it also includes some maybe even more insightful memories of Franklin's family and relatives and childhood friends and former girlfriends. But there's a couple that I'd like to discuss in a little more length with you, Enid. One that I found interesting is the interview you did with Rachel Robinson, the widow of Jackie Robinson. And she tells us about the unique and occasionally testy relationship between Jackie and Franklin. Can you share with us what Mrs. Robinson explained about Jackie and Franklin and their differences and their similarities?
Well, Jackie Robinson was eager to do something for the NAACP. As a public figure, he felt that he could help the organization. So he volunteered, and it was clear that he was not a polished public speaker. So the NAACP called upon their most polished public speaker, Franklin Williams, to take Jackie around to the various places where Franklin would be speaking, and have him observe Franklin, and have Franklin observe him when he gave him a chance to speak. And Franklin had a series of index cards that he would give to Jackie to help groom Jackie as a public speaker. And at first, Jackie was very acquiescent and took all Franklin's suggestions, and that worked out. But after a while, Jackie Robinson, who was very talented off the field as well as on the field, began to develop a style and a presentation of his own. And sometimes he didn't listen to Franklin, and so there was that beginning of a little friction, because Franklin felt that he, as the experienced one, should be giving the directions. But Jackie began to back off that and began to develop his own personal style. Then they got to be friendlier, and Franklin became aware that Jackie Robinson was not a Democrat. And of course, this was an anathema to Franklin. I mean, he couldn't imagine anybody being anything but a Democrat. And he found out that Jackie did not like the Democratic Party and did not like the Kennedys, because he didn't feel that they had done enough to help Black people. And in fact, he was a supporter of Richard Nixon, because he felt that Nixon was more sincere about doing what he said he would do in terms of helping Black people. And so they had that bad vibe between the two of them, and Jackie would call Franklin arrogant, and Franklin would call Jackie naive. But despite all this constant being together, and in fact, Jackie and Rachel moved to Connecticut, where Franklin and Shirley had a home, and they became best of friends. And at that point, Rachel said she watched this often contentious relationship turn into a very close friendship, one that lasted as long until Jackie Robinson died. And it was quite a beautiful and close relationship for both men, ultimately working through their differences as well as their similarities.
And even afterward, Rachel is still alive, I believe, and survived Jackie by several decades. And I think she remained very close to Franklin after Jackie's death, and remained very closely to Franklin's widow, and remains close to their family. But I thought it was interesting that Jackie Robinson was a supporter of Richard Nixon, but also interesting of how he stopped being a supporter of Richard Nixon. It wasn't Watergate that turned him off. It was something Franklin helped uncover and develop, which was that Richard Nixon had restrictive covenants in his deeds to prevent Black people from buying the property, right?
Right, when he lived in California.
Mm-hmm.
And that caused Franklin to take a tremendous interest in the restrictive covenant issue, and he in fact helped write the brief for the case that went to the Supreme Court about the legality of restrictive covenants.
I know housing discrimination became a big thing for him in California for a couple of reasons, and some of it was his own personal experiences. As we've discussed earlier, when Franklin was newly married and needed a place to live, there was a housing development, Stuyvesant Town, which was built with government money to provide housing for returning veterans, but Black people weren't allowed in it. And the developer built a separate and not exactly equal version called Riverton. And Franklin really struggled with that, whether to live there or not. He thought it was a bit of a sellout. And James Baldwin had clearly made very clear that he thought that moving into segregated housing was a deal with the devil. Franklin moved in. He needed a place for his family to live, but I think and generally had a good experience and made good friends in Riverton. But I think that affected him. And then there was the issue in California when he moved to California, and that's a story we'll tell a little bit later. When he was banished to California, he needed a place to live. Obviously, I mean, he had a wife and two children, and that became quite the struggle because he was having difficulty finding a place that would accept blacks. And I think so. Housing discrimination became I think a big deal to him. Now, I want to go to another interview that you did, an interview you did with Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, who was an admiral in the Navy, a chief of naval operations. And one of the things I learned in that I didn't know and have not seen in the archives elsewhere is a role Franklin played in desegregating the Navy. Can you tell us what the admiral told you, Enid?
Well, Admiral Zumwalt was chairman of the board of the Phelps-Stokes Fund, which was quite an accomplishment that Franklin was able to convince Admiral Zumwalt to join the board, because the Phelps-Stokes Fund was not a huge organization. And Admiral Zumwalt was very prominent during the Vietnamese War. And he wanted to segregate the Navy, which was difficult because the Navy had a lot of Southerners chose to join the Navy. And that was the most difficult unit of the armed forces to desegregate. And Admiral Zumwalt called Thurgood Marshall, and he said, I want to desegregate the Navy, but I'm having a hard time. So Thurgood Marshall suggested that he call Franklin Williams. And Franklin Williams spoke to various groups of naval officers, most of whom were hostile to him in the beginning. But by the time he was finished with his usual informed, eloquent manner, he won over these Southern naval officers who were not inclined to take what he had to say seriously. And as a way of saying thank you, Admiral Zumwalt joined the Phelps-Stokes Fund board. And he was at every meeting. And I came to know him and like him very much and respect him greatly. And he said, in the interview I did with him, Frank was an extremely effective leader in my judgment. He had a certain amount of impatience about him that I understand, because he found it difficult to suffer fools gladly. But he had a tremendous IQ, and I'll never forget, his brilliance. And I give him high marks because I don't think he ever exceeded the bonds of courtesy and dignity while moving a board that was sometimes, to some degree, a little slow to support his objectives. And that was the Phelps-Stokes board was a family board, and they had been a missionary family, which was how the organization got started in 1911 by members of the family that had been missionaries in Africa, and they were not always up to the latest efforts to bring about change in our country. And so Franklin was often pushing family members who were somewhat resistant, but Admiral Zumwalt was there, and he saw all this, and he supported Franklin in his efforts to modernize the fund.
And that's one of those stories that's in the footnotes that probably is not well known. Now, you mentioned Thurgood Marshall, and that's a great this is a great time to segue into Thurgood, because the relationship between Franklin and Thurgood is I think fascinating. So Thurgood, of course, was the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund when Franklin came on. He was the boss. And although these were both very, very smart, very committed men, they were very, very different, and they had a very, very testy relationship. Part of it had to do with, well, a clash of egos. You had two pretty sizable egos at play here. But more importantly and more interesting to me was a clash of a clash on strategy. Thurgood was wiser, older, more strategic, in some ways maybe more sensible, but he was very, very cautious. He was very reluctant to take a case to the Supreme Court unless he was supremely confident that he could win. And he had a ridiculously good batting record there. I mean, he argued 32 cases and won 129 of them, which is, it's like batting 900 in the World Series. It's just, very unlikely. Franklin, on the other hand, wanted to roll the dice. He was aggressive, he was young, he was brash. He wanted to take any case that where there was a injustice to the higher court. And Thurgood's reluctance was he fully appreciated, much more than Franklin, I think, the danger of an adverse decision, the danger of an adverse opinion. And I often wonder if Thurgood had happened to bring Brown v. Board of Education, the school desegregation case, if he had happened to bring the exact same case 5 years earlier with the exact same court, would he have won? And I don't know that he would have. And just imagine what would have happened if Thurgood had lost that case, how far that would have set things back. And that it would have been a cataclysmic disaster. Thurgood was aware of that. I'm sure to some extent Franklin was, but as I say, he was a little more willing to roll the dice. But there's also a significant personality clash there. They were very, very different people. And Enid, can you talk about how these were two very, very different men?
Yes, I can. And I often picture the scene. Thurgood was very folksy in his manner, and he kept a bottle of whiskey in his desk because he liked to shoot the breeze with fellow lawyers after work. And he liked to tell ribald stories. He enjoyed telling racial jokes and off-color jokes. And he was very unconcerned with his appearance. No tie, open shirt, whatever. And he was noted for his casual behavior in the office. He called women by their first name. He, hung out at people's desks. So he was a kind of relaxed, laid back person. And Franklin was just the opposite. Franklin was always impeccably dressed. He lacked the common touch. And the thing I always noticed about Franklin that I felt was amazing is he spoke the King's English. I had never heard in all the years that I know him make a grammatical error. I mean, he's the one who taught me the difference between words less and fewer, for example. He never used the wrong pronoun. I mean, that marked him from everybody at the NAACP and elsewhere for that matter. And he was uncomfortable with informality. Franklin felt he was there to do a job. He, came in ready to work, and after he was finished with his work, he went home. There was no hanging out and drinking with the fellows. So that kind of difference in their personalities didn't lend itself for them to build a close personal relationship.
On the other hand, it seems they had a great deal of mutual respect, even though maybe neither of them would have admitted it to the other. And I think of one portion that we have in the film. One of the things we found for the film is an Oval Office secret recording in which Lyndon Johnson recorded a conversation with Thurgood Marshall about lots and lots of things. At the time, Thurgood was Solicitor General, not yet on the Supreme Court. And Johnson is thinking about replacing Sergeant Shriver with Franklin Williams, and he asks Thurgood Marshall, what does he think? And Thurgood goes on and on about how good he is and how smart he is and how valuable he is and what great ideas he has. And so I think there was a great deal of respect. Certainly Thurgood had a lot of respect for Franklin. And I've heard from Frank's son that his father also had a tremendous amount of respect for Thurgood, as he should.
Well, I just wanted to add one thing to that, that very interesting conversation that we have on tape. Thurgood sang, sang praises to Franklin Williams throughout 9/10 of the tape, but at the end he said, but there, you know, he was after my job when I was at the NAACP, and I told him, Franklin, you better look to get the president's job as opposed to mine, because that's never going to happen. So he always knew, despite the fact that they both appreciated each other and respected each other, he knew that Franklin was breathing hard down his neck, and he never forgot that.
It seems, or no, it never forgave it.
No.
What would you say, looking at the totality of the evidence, as the lawyers like to say, what would you say is Franklin's legacy in the civil rights context?
Well, taking a cue from Franklin, because he always used to say, the first slave that ran away was the first fighter for civil rights. And I think that's true. It's hard to rank people, because anybody who contributed to the cause made their own unique contribution. And Franklin's case, he brought legal reasoning and organizational and fundraising skills to the effort for civil rights, and of course his amazing eloquence. So that's what those were his skills, and that's what he brought to the table. But the fact that he was a bridge figure, and in those days there were few of them, that he was comfortable in Black society and in white society, equally comfortable in both arenas. And he could talk to both groups with equal skill, equal charm, equal knowledge. And in that way, he brought people together, and he did that always. And sometimes on a larger scale, but many, many times on a small scale. But, you know, even one by one, he got people to change their minds about race relations. And I think that was his major contribution.
I'd like to discuss a couple examples that illustrate exactly what it is that you're saying. I mentioned earlier that Franklin was banished to California. That was to get him out of Thurgood's sight, basically. So he goes to California. He needs a home. He has a wife and 2 little boys. And as I said, that becomes a problem. And that's kind of a long story, which I won't get into, but he ultimately finds a home. And no sooner do they move in when the neighborhood association, or a group of people who deem themselves the representative of the neighborhood, march over to the Williams house and knock on the door and tell them they don't want them there. They're going to ruin their property values, and they want them to leave. Now, there are a number of things Franklin could have done. He could have screamed and yelled at them. He could have slammed the door. He could have punched them in the nose. He could have called the, well, I guess he could have called the police, but in that time, I don't know that it would have done any good. But what does Franklin do? Franklin invites these people into his home. He invites these people into his home. He sends his sons out to play. And Frank Jr. says they were outside for a long, long time. But by the time they came back, they were all friends. It was welcome to the neighborhood. He made these people see that he was just like them, just another guy trying to make a living, trying to create a good life for his family. And they ended up great friends. Their kids went to school together. They played together. They had neighborhood barbecues together. And I think that's the sort of thing that he did his whole life. Franklin, you know, you can change behavior by force and by intimidation. Franklin wanted to change minds and hearts and cultures, and you can only do that through reason and persuasion. And that's really how he was such a bridge builder, I think. And there's another story that, a similar story that Enid witnessed with a secretary that he had hired, who came here at the height of apartheid from South Africa. Can you tell us, Enid, what happened with the secretary who came over and when she was browsing in the store? And
Yes, we had a secretary from South Africa who liked to spend her lunch hour browsing on Madison Avenue. And she came back to me and said to me that she was very upset because she'd gone into a store and the security guard made it clear that he was following her, he was watching her. If she picked up some merchandise to look at it, he was disapproving, and she was very uncomfortable, and she left. And she came back and she told me about it, and I told Franklin about it, and he jumped up and grabbed his coat and hat and ran out to the store, and he wanted to speak to the owners, and he told the owners that he was very dismayed that his employee, this young woman, had liked to spend her lunch hour looking at their store because she so admired it, and that she was made to feel unwelcome and somewhat like a criminal. And he had a long talk with these people, and by the time he left, they were in his pocket, so to speak. They were just loving him and inviting him back and asking him to come back with the young woman, and that they would make amends to her. They would give her a discount every time she came into the store, and they were utterly turned around by his approach to them. And I thought when he ran out the way he did that he was going to punch somebody in the nose, but absolutely not. That's not how he did things. And he just made friends with these shopkeepers. I don't know how much time we have left, John, but you didn't tell the story about the Eichler homes in California, which was Franklin's major contribution in the area of real estate. Did you
Sure.
talk about that, or do we have time or not?
I think so. When they moved out to California again, Franklin needed a home. There was a major housing developer named, I think it was Joseph Eichler.
Joseph Eichler.
Yeah, and Franklin approached him, wanted to buy a home in one of his developments, and Eichler said, "Oh, don't have any available," which was a flat out lie, and Franklin called him on it. And Franklin kept badgering him, and finally he said, "All right, I'll build you a home as long as you go around to the neighbors and make sure it's okay with them." And Franklin said, "No, I'm not going to audition for the right to buy a house from you." And then he said, "Well, I'll build a development for Black people as long as the NAACP sells the homes." And Franklin said, "No, the NAACP isn't going to become a real estate agency." And finally, he agrees to build a home for Franklin on the outskirts of a housing development. And to back up, Eichler was a card-carrying member of the NAACP, kind of a limousine liberal. He sent lots of money, but when it comes time to putting your money where your mouth is, or putting your mouth where your money is, that's maybe a little bit different. So you have a contract to build the house, and I think it was Eichler's sister or sister-in-law, who's a member of his board, comes to him and says, "You can't do that. You're going to ruin the business, blah, 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 blah." And Eichler says, "Enough. This is too much trouble to build one house, to sell one house. I'm breaking the contract." And Franklin says, "If you break that contract, I will sue you for breach of contract, and I will smear your name from one end of California to the other." So Eichler's pressured to do it, to build it, and he builds it. And during the construction, these two men become great friends. Eichler becomes one of the major proponents of housing equity throughout California. He builds all kinds of houses for minorities of every stripe, and becomes a minor hero in the civil rights movement. Again, this is a case, Franklin changed minds and attitudes and cultures through that bridge building approach. And we are starting to run low on time, but what appeals to me about Franklin and kind of I marvel at is he was not a hater. I mean, this is a guy born in 1917 with all the indignities of the Jim Crow era. He was 30 years old before Black people could play Major League Baseball. He was 37 years old before the schools were desegregated. He endured terribly painful discrimination as a child. He experienced the segregated army. He came darn close to being lynched. yet he was not a hater. How do you explain that, Enid? How was he able to not be a hater?
I can't explain it. I really can't explain it. I mean, it was just in the nature of him. I will say one thing about it is that Franklin was well educated. Franklin was smart and he knew it. Franklin had an interesting background. His grandfather had come from the South from a family of slave holding blacks. His grandmother had worked with a white family who, when they traveled to Europe, took her with them. So he had a very rich background in many ways. And early on, he thought to himself, I'm smarter than these white folks who want to look down on me. So he never felt inferior. In fact, most of the time, he felt pretty superior, especially, when he went down south and argued the Groveland case and found himself in a room with a bunch of white people who he thought were not worthy of his time and attention. So he could never get it clear that people were looking down on him. And he never accepted that he was lesser than. And I think that was really important and enabled him to deal with white people as an equal and not be in any way hostile or in any way, feeling secondary or lesser than. He could deal with a white person the same way he dealt with a black person, and I think that came from his sense that he was equal to anybody that he was going to be encountering.
Yes and no. I'm going to disagree with you slightly because, as you know, he did carry around our racial consciousness his whole life. And I want to end by reading a quote. And this is something that is not in the archives yet, but it will be very shortly. It's from an interview that Enid had with Franklin on his deathbed. Franklin was dying and he knew it, and he's reflecting on his life. And this is what he says. I am still handicapped by a consciousness of my race. I always think there are people sitting there saying, what is he doing here? I have never gotten over it. It's so bad that I have few shoes that fit me, because when I go into a shoe store, I try on a pair of shoes, and after the third or fourth pair, I become so goddamn self-conscious that I'm thinking this guy is thinking this poor end doesn't have any business in here in the first place and obviously can't afford them. That's why he's not buying them. I have never walked out of a shoe store without buying shoes. I tell you, it's a horrible thing. I hate it. I can't do it. I can't get up and walk out of that store. Isn't it terrible to be at my age and never be able to rid yourself of those fears? Now think about that for a minute. This is an astonishingly accomplished man who achieved so much in his lifetime, and he's thinking about shoes on his deathbed. So I think there was that element.
Well, there was that element, but basically, and deep down, Franklin felt that he was good as anybody else.
I'm sure.
I'd have felt that he had to let the shoe salesman know that he was affluent enough to be in that store and he could do what he wanted in terms of how many shoes he would buy. But Franklin never felt that he had to take second place to anybody. He really didn't.
Good. I see we have a number of questions we can get to. Josie, do you want to?
I will, yes. So we do have some questions, and they kind of fall into two categories. There's some questions about Franklin, and there are some questions about you. So we'll start with the questions about Franklin. In your documentary, it was mentioned that Franklin did not like the message of Black militants, especially the Black Panther Party. Did his opinion on that change over time?
That's for you, Enid.
No. He didn't like bad behavior, and he didn't like bad behavior on anybody's part. He didn't like people who shouted. He didn't like people who used vulgarity. Again, poor use of language. All of that. He just was a turnoff for him. So he never changed. That was intrinsic to his personality. He liked people to say their piece civilly.
Well, speaking of peace, that's a great segue to one of our other questions, which is, can you tell us more about Franklin's role in the Peace Corps?
I can say some things about it. He was one of the first people joining the Peace Corps. Sergeant Shriver chose him to be his special assistant, and it was a very good choice because the idea was to get young people into foreign countries to teach English and to familiarize themselves with other cultures. That was the basic underlying principle of the Peace Corps. But these countries didn't want Peace Corps people in them because they assumed that they were spies, they were CIA operatives. And it was only because Franklin had gone to Lincoln University with Kwame Nkrumah, the president of Ghana, that Ghana became the first person to take a chance and allow the Peace Corps to come in. And of course, when the Peace Corps came in, these young, dedicated students who were so happy to be teaching and working in a foreign country and learning another culture and sometimes another language, that the other leaders began to see that the Peace Corps was not indeed as they had managed it to be. So Franklin performed a great service in getting the Peace Corps going. He also recruited some very excellent people. For example, C. Payne Lucas, who became president of Caher later in his career, and Frank Mankiewicz, who was somebody who had headed the ADL in California and worked very closely with Franklin, and Franklin knew that he was a Spanish speaker, so he recruited him, and Frank became first country director of Peru and then head of the entire South American region. So Franklin did a great job recruiting for the Peace Corps. He had one major disappointment in the Peace Corps was he was given the assignment of bringing Peace Corps people in through the United Nations. And he made a presentation to the United Nations to get them to adopt the Peace Corps and to work along as a partner with the Peace Corps. And that was not successful. And so that was a large part of his responsibility that he never got to fulfill. But basically, he did do a lot. And he and Sergeant Shriver were very friendly until Franklin died.
Okay, we also have some questions about you. So, John, you described yourself, I think, as a recovering journalist, and Enid,
I'm struggling with it recovering.
Enid, you're an anthropologist. How did the two of you find each other and start working on this topic together?
A little bit accidentally. The way this whole thing began is I now work for the court system, and I work occasionally with the Franklin Williams Commission. And the commission had asked me to help them on a little project some years ago. And I knew a very, very, very little about Franklin. And I started looking into him and I went, oh, wow, holy cow. And then we decided to do an internal film, unfunded, just an internal film. And in researching that, we got to the Schomburg, which is where all of his papers are archived. And we went into a description at some point where it says archived by Enid Gort. It said, well, who in the world is Enid Gort? And then I chased her down, which is difficult. I was beginning to think she was in the witness protection program or something, but I did eventually find her. And then that's how we connected. So we connected on the film first. And then Enid had written a thesis on Franklin. And then somewhere along the line, we decided to revamp her thesis and turn it into a book.
So it's an archive story.
It's exactly what it is.
Do we have time for me to add to that?
Yeah, please.
Oh, so John called me and he asked to come to talk to me because he didn't know who I was and he didn't know what I knew. So he came with a woman who was heading the
Joyce Hartsfield.
Yes, to the commission, and we were sitting in my dining room, and I was saying that I had worked for Franklin for many years, and I had interviewed people, and they were sitting, and that's nice. And then I brought them into my office, which is the room we're sitting in now. And I don't know if you can see over here there are 4 file cabinets. And I pulled out the file cabinet and I said, oh, well, you can't see it here, I'm sorry. But these are big file cabinets. They run the length of the wall. And I pulled them out and I said, you see all these? I said, these are transcripts of interviews I did with Franklin Williams. And they were absolutely speechless. And then I showed them my tape collection, which was filling up the shelves to the ceiling. And I'll never forget their look to each other. It was so incredulous that I felt like they felt they had discovered a gold mine, which they
did. We did. And that very same gold mine is, or very will soon, or will be available for public inspection at the Schomburg.
Well, that's great. What a great way to bring it all full circle. So I think we're out of time, but I want to thank you so much for this great presentation today and for sharing everything that you have unearthed and learned and worked on together about this important figure. And I want to thank everybody who joined us today also. And I would like to let you know that if you're interested in the content that we create and you would like to see some more of it, you can always contact us at aptrust@nysed.gov. And you can receive a free past issue of New York Archives magazine. And also, I would like to invite you all to join us on March 14th at 12:30 for our next New York Archives Magazine online speaker series entitled Finding What You Love in New York, Marketing the Empire State, with Ross Levy, New York State Division of Tourism. I love New York. And if you're interested in that program or any information about any of the other programs that we have coming up, please visit our website, www.nysarchivestrust.org, and you can register there or learn more about what else we're up to. So again, John and Enid, thank you so much for this great presentation today.
Thank you, Josie.
Thank you very much, Josie.
Have a great day.
Thank you, you too.